Good morning, everyone. My name is Christina Kwok, and I am a fellow here at the Center for Universal Education at Brookings. And on behalf of Rebecca Winthrop and Emiliana Vegas, our co-directors, I wanted to welcome you all here today to our annual Girls Education Research and Policy Symposium. So great to see familiar faces and some new friends in the room, as always. So today we're launching the reports of our 9th cohort of Echidna Global Scholars, whom I will introduce to you all throughout the day. And for those of you who aren't familiar, the Echidna Global Scholars program is a visiting fellows program aimed at amplifying the work of grassroots girls' education leaders from around the world, and to also generate and communicate evidence-based solutions to improving learning opportunities for girls. We've now hosted 31 fellows from 18 countries, and this program would not be possible without the generous support of Echidna Giving. This year, the Echidna Scholars Research allows us to investigate 3 critical entry points for improving girls' learning opportunities across her lifetime, which is the theme of this year's symposium. We'll be looking at the early childhood years with Samyukta Subramanian's research in India, STEM education for adolescent girls with Nasreen Siddiqa from Bangladesh, and finally, girls' transitions to work with Anil Paudel's work on TVET in Nepal. We'll also have the opportunity to engage these entry points throughout the day in discussions at the policy level with our distinguished panelists, who are also joining me this morning here, and also after lunch, and then as well as some breakout sessions that will get into more of the implementation implications in the afternoon. And importantly, the Echidna Scholars Research poses to us a critical question of what it means to reach a little higher in our aspirations and actions when it comes to achieving gender equality in and through education. Each year, we try to tackle the question of how do we, as a global community, reach and achieve systems change for girls. And this year, we hope to look more critically at what it means to aim for a gender-transformative agenda in which the social norms, the relations of power, and the policy environment that undergird gender unequal relations of power are dismantled and reconstructed anew. So to help kick us off on this day and to hold us accountable to this critical agenda, I'm pleased to introduce our first speaker, Robert Jenkins. I won't read his entire bio, you have it in your agenda packet in front of you, but I will say that Rob joins us at the apex of a long career in international development and humanitarian assistance at UNICEF. Rob is now the Chief of Education at UNICEF, as well as the Associate Director of UNICEF's Program Division. So if you all join me in welcoming Rob to the stage.
Good morning. Thank you very much. Let me also just from UNICEF appreciate the invitation. Thank you very much to Christina Kwok, to Emiliana Vega, and also to Rebecca Winthrop for the kind invitation. I'm really excited by the discussions of today. I love the way it's been framed. I'm going to have a few norms that I'm going to present. I only have 10 minutes, and I'll stick to that. But let me start by saying I think we should not spend too much time talking about the importance of girls' education. Some of you may be surprised I would start with that, but I figure you've come to today, to this meeting, convinced girls' education is important. And having only been on this job in headquarters for 3 or 4 months, I'm amazed at how much time people spend at the global level reassuring themselves that what they do is important. So I think we just, if anyone's not convinced of girls' education, you've come to the wrong meeting, basically. What I think we do want to spend time is talking about solutions and how to transform systems. And those are heavy lifting words, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time on that. I do want to maybe just take a second and frame this by saying we absolutely have a global learning crisis. And I mean global, I mean within a mile of this building. I come from Canada, definitely very much a learning crisis in Canada, but also in the countries where UNICEF works more intensely. And there's tons of statistics that will prove that we have a learning crisis, and indeed we're using that word on purpose. But one of which will be announced more formally in a few days, but that talk about the percentage of 10-year-olds that can read, many of which have probably already heard some of that statistic, but we're into more than 70% in low and middle income countries, 10-year-olds cannot read. and 50% in Latin and South America, more than 75% in Africa. So we also, within that learning crisis dimension, we obviously have very real statistics globally about the challenges, particularly for girls. So how do we transform a system that's in crisis? What I would suggest is we need to do things differently. What we are currently doing is not working. And when I mean we, I mean all of us involved in education, and that includes parents and children themselves, but also what UNICEF would call the duty bearers, people that have duties to rights holders, and those in this meeting in the next couple of days we're going to focus on girls. So the duty bearers need to do something different. One tension, at least within UNICEF, is going to be how much do we spend strengthening systems, and in the new UNICEF strategy talks about system strengthening, but what if the system itself is perpetuating inequities? So then instead we're looking at disruption. And I see a lot of people nodding, so we're in the right crowd. I see a lot of familiar faces too, which is nice. That's also interesting. Now coming to headquarters after many years in various postings, it seems like there's about 40 or 50 people that attend all these meetings, so that's they're here. How do we disrupt education systems in a constructive way? These are all big words, and we have to now unpack those. Maybe a better question is, who has done it and where? And therefore, what can we model in other countries that may be applicable? Now, some of you may go, careful, you can't take a case study from Thailand and import it to Canada, or you can't take from Zambia and take it to Vietnam. I think that's true. However, there may be some lessons that we can draw, which I guess is what we're going to spend time now in the next day figuring out. What are the lessons that can be drawn from some positive deviance, if you like that terminology, from examples of where systems have transformed themselves? Now, first of all, what do we mean by system? For me, an education system is as broad a term as possible. It's everyone and anything that enables children to continue on their learning pathway. And I'm sorry, it's going to make people uncomfortable, but more and more that is not necessarily going to be sitting in a room with four walls with a teacher at the front telling them what to think and what to learn. And that is, even as a parent, that's worrying, because you start to increasingly see that children will have access to many different ways of learning. Now, that's worrying, like I said. It also is an amazing opportunity for us. Us, again, collectively, those who are involved in providing learning opportunities for children. It is an amazing opportunity to disrupt, but that is going to mean a mind shift for all of us in leveraging these new actors and new players that are coming into this space with lots to offer. And that will be the private sector, that will be other non-state actors, it'll be community groups, it will be et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think it's going to be very important for those of us who've come from the public sector as almost an exclusive lens, for us to ourselves open up and be inclusive. Obviously, in the best interest of the child, there's lots of caveats, but if we start with a crisis, needing to do something different, I think being inclusive in the discussion and being inclusive of who has good ideas and who can help us disrupt constructively, it's a no-brainer. We need to be inclusive. We need to as broad a net as possible. Anyone who has anything to offer to this crisis, let's welcome them to the discussion. Now, what does a transformed system look like that is inclusive of girls? And all of us would probably have our own ideas of what that looks like. It's easy to see it at the child level. If you kind of close your eyes and think, what does an empowered 18, 19, 20-year-old girl looks like, it's just something that kind of exhibits itself. They're empowered, they're expressive, they're dynamic, they engage, they push back, they have lots of opinions, etc. But what does a transformed system as a whole look like? I think we need to recognize we need to proactively address barriers. So there's a positive side and a negative side, meaning we need to remove the negatives and promote the positives. Maybe let's talk about the barriers on the negative. So what are the barriers that we need to table in the next day to realize the rights of every girl? One of absolutely is violence. And this conversation cannot really begin unless we talk about violence. And that, again, is going to make people uncomfortable, but I'm sorry, it's time to be uncomfortable if you haven't been uncomfortable already. Now, violence in all its forms. That includes your physical violence and threat of sexual violence and actual perpetration of sexual violence, but it also is verbal violence and within the school environment, on the way to school, within the home to get to, before you even leave towards school. So where has a system transformed itself to address violence? Absolutely critical. I want to also, that's a question that needs to be answered. The good news is there are examples of that, and those are going to come in the next day. Another big barrier are the beliefs, and was mentioned in the opening remarks, the beliefs and social norms of parents, of children themselves, of schools, of teachers, of communities, etc. That, to me, is overcomable in that we can leverage social media, we can leverage other ways of interacting with children, we can promote a new way of thinking of girls and of gender discrimination in order to transform communities and transform the social norm. I often see, people think social norms take time. There's lots of examples of where it's absolutely dramatically changed itself in a very short period. There's an expression, the world will never move as slow as it is today. And that's true, right? We think it's fast now, just wait. And again, that's also an incredible asset for us to address this crisis. So let's embrace it and let's take on social norms head on. On the positive side, I've already mentioned what we can reinforce in terms of new actors and new players in this space. To me, I also think maybe it's a time for the system to almost just get out of the way and maybe just to sum it up, let chaos reign. But what I mean by that is there are so many opportunities now for girls, boys, etc. if we just enable the assets to reach these children, whether that be online, whether that be in person, whether that be through their parents, whether that be in schools, whether that be outside of school. So and I've got to stop. I'm going to conclude with, I'm incredibly optimistic about the future. There have been many positive trends. The challenge is enormous, but with all the new speed of change and all the new assets we have, I think a room full of people like this can make a real difference. But let's not reassure ourselves that what we do is worth it. Let's take that as given. I think now let's move into the uncomfortable space, ask some tough questions, but also let's model those who have made change happen. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Rob. And while we're all getting mic'd up here, I'm just going to go ahead and get started with some of our introductions. To my left, I have Liana Marr, who is the Director of the Office of Education within the Bureau of Economic Growth, Education, and Environment at the U.S. Agency for International Development. She also joins, you can't hear us. Okay. I'll speak a little bit louder until the mics go on. She also joined us after a long career in education as a Foreign Service Officer. And then to her left is Hugo Gorst-Williams, who plays an instrumental role in the UK's leadership of girls' education efforts as the girls' education team leader at the Department for International Development in the UK. And a fun fact for you all, before Hugo joined the civil service, I thought this was great, he worked to help locate and recover stolen art. So I think that's very, we don't see that in our space of girls' education. So
Nice.
And you all know Rob. To his left is Martha Muezi, who is the executive director of FAWE Africa, the Forum for African Women Educationalists, where she heads up FAWE's regional secretariat. She has risen to this role after a long career at FAWE Uganda, including serving as its executive director. And then to her left is Bhagyashree Dengel, who is the Asia Regional Director at Plan International. And before entering this position, she was the Executive Director of Plan International India, where she expanded the organization's reach, scale, and impact on girls through gender-transformative programs. So I wanted to start off this conversation really by piggybacking off of Rob's remarks around the need to really trigger this systems-wide change and a disruptive, transformative systems change. And in the girls' education community, especially in the last year or so, we've really seen the space shift from focusing solely on girls' education to thinking about gender equality in and through education. And through that, we've heard a discussion shift from ensuring that systems provide a gender-sensitive education to a gender-responsive education, and now to a gender-transformative education. And so I want us to unpack what that means, because I think language matters and discourse matters. So I wanted to start off maybe first with Liana to tell us, what does this shift in language mean amongst our stakeholder communities, especially from the bilateral community?
Right. I think for me, I'm really happy to hear people talking about a systems approach as opposed to just talking about getting girls into school. Because if we stop and think about it, what we're doing is pipelining girls into a male-dominated system, education system, and everything that comes along with that. Whether it's school-related gender-based violence, and we all know that it's female students and female teachers that are often the victim of that gender-related violence in the school systems. So, when we look across the board, we see a lot of women teaching at the primary level, but very few at the secondary and tertiary, even fewer as head teachers, even fewer as inspectors, and fewer yet at the ministry levels. What would it do if we had women's voices at the table at all of those levels when we talk about gender education? I believe the dialogue would be completely different. I believe with more head teachers and more female teachers, the accountability of teachers who sexually abuse students would be much greater. I think that our discussions around what it would take to protect teachers and get more teachers into the field at the secondary level would be very different. I also think we'd be having stronger dialogue around encouraging women to study for male-dominated jobs, which, let's face it, ladies, they tend to be better paying jobs and more stable jobs. So I think it's one of the things that makes me so excited about the Brookings program, encouraging female leaders in the education system across the board. So I really hope that as donors and others will take a look at how we can more systemically address the leadership gap in education.
Great, thank you, yes. And definitely the leadership piece, I think, it's one of our sort of core pillars in terms of how we see systems change happening. Bhagyashree, I wanted to maybe throw the question over down to you at the end of our row here. Plan has done some groundbreaking work in gender transformative education. And amidst that, and I think all of us in the audience probably have heard this question come up all the time in every girls' education event, is what about the boys? So we hear about the need to really address violence and eliminate violence against girls and women. And oftentimes that is perpetrated by boys, but then in other cases, in some contexts, boys' learning outcomes are poorer than girls. And so a focus on girls' education itself oftentimes raises this question. What about the boys? So how does this question affect your own strategic agenda around girls' education? And how does that really bring us to this question around creating a gender transformative education?
Okay. So at Plan International, I have personally seen the whole evolution from, as we were just talking about, gender responsive, sensitive, and transformative. So we have gone through all those phases of responding to the needs of the communities, and currently we are deeply rooted in designing programs in the most gender transformative way. And gender equality is not just about girls, it's about girls and boys, men and women. And if we focus on equality for all, the men also benefit. So I'm not going to get into the theory of it, but I'll just cite some examples from my own experiences in communities and how it benefits even men and boys. So just a few months ago, I met this girl from Planned Program Communities. She came from a snake charmers community, and typically none of the girls from that community went ever to school. After Plan's interventions, we had most of the girls attending schools. Social norm was early child marriage, but because we were able to invest in building girls' agency, she was able to push back, influence with the help of her peers, her parents, to delay that marriage. She was the first girl from that community to complete her 10 years of schooling. And when I met her, she was married, she had a daughter. She did marry early, but just after the age of 16. Her husband was a snake charmer who was illiterate. She was able to influence him to go back to studies through distance learning. He gave up his profession of snake charming, which was anyways illegal. He joined a security agency. She has a daughter, and her daughter is studying in school. And that's for me truly the impact of all the work that we do. And we have thousands of such examples in Nepal, in Bangladesh. So it benefits girls and boys both. The second example, just because you asked the question about boys, safer cities. I mean, it's again a global initiative for Plan International, and we are working in number of cities, and I was interacting with these adolescent girls and boys, and I asked these boys, what's in it for you? Because Safer Cities program is seen as benefiting girls, and they told me this story. They said how much they have learned from this program, because for them it was masculine to tease girls, to go after them, to scare them, wait for them after schools, follow them. But they said, but as they became part of this program, and along with girls, they started doing safety audits. They started learning about how girls felt about safety issues and started identifying with it. And they said this was completely new to us. It was cool for us to tease them, but today we don't want to do it. In fact, they are peer educators and leaders in their own communities and are passing that message of how girls feel and why everybody should be working towards safety of girls and boys both. And that's the impact we can create and see on the ground in Plan International.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I think it piggybacks off of Rob's point very nicely too, that we have this notion that change takes time, and I think in cases like your programming, evolution may take time, but change can happen in one generation, right? In terms of just simply addressing some of those social norms and some of the beliefs and attitudes, right?
And empowering communities, girls and boys, and helping them take charge, and so that they can make those choices and lead that change in their own communities and in their own lives.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Martha, maybe I can ask you too. FAWE has been doing extraordinary work promoting gender-responsive pedagogy across the African continent. How does this, this attention towards gender transformation and transformative change, systems change, how does that get reflected in the work that you all are doing at FAWE?
Yeah, thank you so much. I want to start by saying, as FAWE, we've been into promoting girls' education for now over 27 years. And I would gladly say that I never apologize for promoting girls' education. And why I don't do that is because I'm convinced there is still a very great need to do that. We've been in forums where, of course, discussions have come up about boys. I personally do appreciate that when we are talking about gender, we're not talking about girls. Gender is about girls, it's about boys, it's about men and women. But when we are focusing on girls' education, it's like we are looking, the boys have unique needs. The girls have unique needs. And so are the men and the women. And when we are designing intervention, it's very good to look at what are the challenges of the girls? What are the challenges of the boys? And what is the rightful intervention? And when you're intervening, who are the key players? These are the men, these are the women, these are the girls themselves, community, policymakers, all of them. And therefore, when intervening, it's about coming up with a holistic approach. In FAWE's work, when we focus on girls' education, it does not in any way mean that we leave aside the boys or the men or the women, not at all. But what we do is the interventions that we put in for girls are very different. I'll give an example. When we say there are those girls that are very intelligent, that would perform very well, but they are not able to do so because of resources. But when we go to a community and we realize, because our work is normally informed by research, you will know that in such and such a community, even the boys are equal at risk. And what we do, it depends on the magnitude of the problem. We design a program in such a way that all persons benefit from the service. We shall say, for instance, in Community X, we have scholarships going to 70% girls and 30% boys. And that is arrived at because of looking at the magnitude of the problem, the kind of challenges that the girls face. And I'm sure you will all agree with me that if we want equality in education, we start with equity. We start by trying to level the platform and make sure that all benefit from whatever service that is available. And because of that, I want to say, even as we are talking about gender equality, it does not stop us from focusing on girls. It does not stop us from focusing on boys if the need is there. But in all that we do, we have an empowerment program for girls, which is Tuseme. It means speaking out. In that program, the target are the girls, but with boys as the allies and tapping on the wisdom of the adults. So each and every person has a role to play. And taking it from that angle, the boys come to appreciate the challenges that their sisters are facing. They appreciate the challenges that their mothers are facing. So they walk along and they support them. But it's not about discrimination, it's not about leaving the boys behind, because it's something that has come up. But I want to say I still subscribe to the school of thought of saying girls' challenges still exist and we need to pay specific attention. We don't need to be, moved because somebody has come up with something that they want to promote. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a testament to the need to really pay attention to the gatekeepers, the decision makers, and to ensure that system level change happens from that entry point, right? I think that goes very well to the question that I wanted to ask you, Hugo, in terms of how this gender transformative agenda, what does it mean for DFID in terms of your global leadership in girls' education? You all just launched last year, I think, this global platform for girls' education. How does this align with your agenda?
So thank you, and thank you for this already rich conversation and for inviting us here. So I think girls' education is right at the heart of what DFID's approach to the Sustainable Development Goals is, to the UK's approach to poverty eradication, to prosperity, to empowerment more broadly. I think the transformative narrative links actually to what Rob was saying in terms of the need to be radical, the need to be, I wouldn't quite say chaos reign, but go into that sort of, that recognition that even language like responsive is by definition a little bit passive. And actually we need to be active, and we need to be activists, and we need to motivate activists to be prominent in that space. I think when I think about our suite of interventions that we do as the UK, we have the obvious sort of ones, which are the sort of the programmatic ones. So the Girls' Education Challenge, which is the world's largest fund on girls' education, through which we make a huge suite of fantastic interventions at a project level across 17 countries, 41 projects, running since 2012. But there's also what we do through our bilateral programming, so through our country offices. There's then the interventions we do through our multilateral interventions, so working with everyone from UNICEF to the bank to others in terms of how do we engage with multilateral activities, so those actions by others. But then there's that broader influence piece, that actually if we want to make a systems change, if we want to make an impact, it's about leadership, and it's about leadership at all levels. It's about regional, local, community leadership, but it's also up at that sort of stratospheric political leadership angle. So last year, 2018, the sort of platform for girls' education, with a particularly a Commonwealth focus, was something that the UK launched alongside Kenya, co-chairing with Kenya, with a focus really on how do we build a political narrative and momentum around girls' education. And I'd mirror much as what's already been said about, I think girls' education is a bit of a shorthand, and actually often what we're talking about is gender equality through education, and it brings in all those multifaceted angles. We know in this room what we're talking about when we're talking about girls' education, but we do have that necessity to explain at times. And quickly on the boys' point, I've had it said to me both at that political level and in a schoolroom in Sierra Leone by a boy himself, what about the boys? And I think we've had a really strong suite of answers which are absolutely spot on in terms of we do stuff for boys, both for themselves and to support gender equality. You can't make the progress we need to make for 50% of the population if you don't tackle the other 50% in terms of the conversation, in terms of actually addressing the sexual violence, addressing those norms, because they are right at the heart of it. And it's not just in the most fragile context in the world. We run a program called Connecting Classrooms, where we connect classrooms in partner countries with UK classrooms, and we have conversations there about gender norms. We bring in, whether it's sort of female mechanics or male hairdressers, to say there isn't a set way of doing anything. And at that really early age, understanding what those perceptions are that need to be challenged. But in terms of what we are doing, I think it's that political level through things like the platform, through engagement at UNGA, through engagement at the G7, the Commonwealth, continuing to make noise, but not unproductive noise, but to maintain momentum and attention in a way that mobilises, yes, investment, but with it, activity and action. And what Rob was saying earlier about bringing on new partners, the private sector, innovative actors who don't necessarily have the same structures and baggage and ways of thinking that the rest of us have, is something we absolutely ought to be doing. So I think we need to be radical. That involves addressing the systems. To do the systems right involves learning the lessons that we're doing at project level. So for example, yes, we have the Girls' Education Challenge with all of those projects. How do we build on that knowledge in a way that when we have a conversation with Government X or Governor Y or Teacher Z, that we bring that learning into that setting and say, we know this works in that place, try this, here's how we can support you.
Great. So it sounds like, when my original question around, what does this shift in discourse mean for girls' education stakeholders? It sounds like, at least at the individual and organizational level, there's this underlying sentiment that it's already sort of aiming for gender transformation or gender transformative change, and that perhaps the discourse is merely catching up to some of that underlying sentiment or not. But Rob, I think you sort of highlighted in your opening remarks, you've heard this discourse for many years now. And so if that underlying sentiment and the recognition that change needs to happen at a systems level, radical change needs to happen, but systems don't like radical change because systems are intended to maintain themselves, what do the organizations here on this panel need to do, or the people in this room need to do, to really ensure we don't, in 20 years, have the same questions and the same conversations, but perhaps with a different term?
I think it's a great question. I am worried that we're all just talking to ourselves, and we definitely need to talk to people not convinced. I'm going to be trying to be more disciplined now. I've got 5 quick responses to this. One is we need to be evidence-based. And I think a lot of things that are happening in our organizations, including my own in UNICEF, we're investing a lot of money in areas that are not based on solid evidence. Or to say it nicely, there's a lot of room for us to shift to clear interventions that have had an impact. Secondly, there is absolutely a resource gap issue here. To address girls' education, it's going to require resources. Public, private, community, parents, etc. And so we'll need to leverage more resources. So all of us to go out from this room to be more convinced on the need to leverage our platforms to generate more resources to address the barriers that girls are facing, number 2. Number 3, we need to adopt a life cycle approach in our interventions. Now we're getting kind of into this terminology, but basically I don't think in the conversation around STEM or in livelihoods, you can take that, you're gonna solve a problem for 18-year-old girls when you're not looking also even at early childhood education. So I think we all agree that we're gonna need to look across the age group. And so starting from early childhood education or before, to transition to livelihoods. And I've seen it coming from the Middle East in the last 5 years. Girls graduating from medical school and 80% of which are unemployed in Jordan after 5 years. So even if you gain in certain space in education, if society is not changing in livelihood in the labor market. So life cycle. Number 4, it has to be multi-sectoral because there is no way you're going to just fix the education system. Again, back to violence, back to poor healthcare, female hygiene within schools, sanitation, security, et cetera, et cetera. So we need to look multi-sectorally. And lastly, we need to look at scale. So this is like the gold star. But I think, again, the number of interventions and the amount of money we spend on small project approaches that will reach 50, 100, 200 girls or in 5 communities or in one specific sector or in one specific age group, that by definition is not transformative. So it's a tall order, but I think, again, with the resources in this room and the resources of all of ours, if we follow that as my suggestion, I think we have a chance at not being back here 20 years from now having the same conversation.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Rob. Martha, what about you at FAWE? What do you and your colleagues think or see needs to happen more quickly?
Yeah, thank you. I think some of the issues have been raised by Robert, but I would just add, and what seems very critical is we need to walk the talk. Be more practical, because there is usually a tendency of talking and having all the good policies, but then they're not implemented. And who is to implement it? It's us. We are part of the team that need to make that happen. And we also appreciate that there is a shrinking space, the fiscal space, in terms of investment in girls' education. There is priorities change every other day, and that comes with the leadership. If my interest is not in education, I'll ensure that there's a shift from education. And that also affects what is done. Just like he said, in terms of investment, increased investment is what makes us move. If we talk without investment, then it means the results will not be there, and every other time we shall keep coming back and talking about the same. It's about the political conversations. What's happening? What is our play? What is our space in those political conversations? Are we able? Do we have the ability? And when I say we, I mean we as civil society. I mean as multilateral organizations. Do we have the space to get in there and also make proposals in terms of what needs to work? There is a funding aspect. There is the implementation aspect. Is the funder and the implementer talking? Are they talking? Is it dictatorship or is it bilateral? Am I telling you do this, or are we saying can we do this? And we do this because it has proved that it works. There is also the issue of, he has mentioned it, but in terms of building synergies, who is doing what and where? Are we competing, or are we looking at ourselves? For instance, if I talk about civil society, are we looking at ourselves as complementary partners, or are we looking at ourselves as competitors? If we build synergies, if we know who is doing what and where, if there is documentation for learning purposes, sharing information across the board. If I'm working in India, why can't I share the same information of what I've done and what has proved to work? I share it with somebody else in Indonesia. And that way, we are able to create a stronger voice and be able to move forward. There is what he mentioned about education without deliberate effort into transition to the world of work. I think that's why we keep talking every other day, because we are not breaking the vicious cycle. We are getting educated, but what does that mean? What does it translate to? Am I able to get that education and come out productively and contribute to the development of the nation, to the development of my neighbors, of my community? If that is lacking, then the chances that we shall continue talking about the same are very high. And I also want to say some of the interventions that we come up with may not be sustainable or may not be impactful. I know we've given bursaries. I know we've built capacities for teachers. But like it was mentioned, it's the whole system. We need to look at the whole system. By supporting the teacher, I may not be creating the impact that is expected, because the teacher alone is not going to perform miracles. If I'm supporting the girl without looking at the community, without looking at the family, it may not, because one will disrupt the other. So it's about the whole system. And lastly, it's about having the affected persons being on top of the whole planning and decision making. Do we have the young people as part of the process? Are they able to contribute? Are they able to talk and say what they feel they need? Or shall we continue planning for them, going into round tables and deciding this is what the youth need, this is what the girls need, this is what they need to do, and this is how it should be done? Let them be part of the planning process. And I feel if that is taken, then the chances of us, reducing on the number of times that we come back to talk about the same issues will materialize. Thank you.
Thank you, Martha. I think your point about the building synergies is just spot on, because I think in a system where, especially when you think about the need to differentiate and to set oneself apart in a system of girls' education actors, that incentive to differentiate inhibits the ability to collaborate. And I think competition just emerges from that. And I think that's something that the girls' education community really needs to begin to look internally and to figure something out, because that's a big hindrance. And in thinking about that system and the system of actors, Bhagatri, I was curious if you see the issue, at least from your work and plan, is it a capacity issue? Is it an organizational capacity issue? Is it the capacity of leaders? Is it the capacity of implementers? What might be hindering quicker action?
Surely, it's capacity at all levels. So when we talk about quality education, gender transformative education, how do we really build the capacities? When we talk about engaging with multiple stakeholders, duty bearers, young people, we need to definitely do that capacity assessment. And one such example is like at school governance level. How do we build capabilities? We talk about teachers training, but that's not adequate. Particularly in South Asia, there are these mandated school management committees. That's the school level governance. What is it that we can do to build capacities of those committees, because they are so much closer to the school and directly responsible for education quality? And that's where we have lot of successes, whether it's Bangladesh, Nepal or India. Thousands of schools where plan has played that critical role as a catalyst to ensure that there is participation of multiple stakeholders, be it children, teachers, principals, communities and government as part of the management committees, and then having training on gender transformative education. That's where they start challenging social norms. They start looking at barriers which stop the girls from accessing education, the root causes, and it's not enough. That one training is not enough. So parallelly also what we do is how do we build girls' agency, how do we build leadership of girls and boys where they start challenging and they start actively taking part in making a difference. At Plan, we are also very excited about this research or study that we have done on Girls Leadership Index, which we will be publishing in 2020. And we have looked at enabling environment across 16 countries in Asia. So we have looked at protection, education, health, and it all has an impact on learning outcomes. And that is something which we can use as an advocacy and influencing tool with the government to engage governments to address all those barriers that the girls are facing or even boys are facing within their context. Because unless we address, as Robert mentioned, I think that is that entire life cycle approach. Where are the barriers and how are we going to address and then build those capabilities of key stakeholders? I think that's what is very critical.
Great. Thank you. And on your point of governments, I want to ask Hugo, from your perspective at DFID, do you see are governments attuned to the need to really change systems for girls? Because, like I said before, systems and governments want to maintain status quo in some ways, right? Are we at risk of really at government systems level, at risk of just talking the talk and not necessarily following with the action and the noise and the attention and the momentum, the resources?
We are, yeah, we're absolutely at risk of that. So I think, it varies wildly in terms of the individuals, the organisations, but I was reflecting on some of what's already been said, and so much is about incentives. Where are the organisation and human incentives of people to make a stand, make a change, be disruptive, and in places where political cycles might be quite short, but the impacts might be, they can be radically rapid, but maybe not within a political cycle, and that's a challenge. So where is the incentive for an individual to challenge their own system, if you like, to both and that applies at not only the political level, but also at the regional, at a local level, at a school level. We'll know, you go to schools and you'll have exactly the same system on paper in place between one school and another school, but you have an inspirational head teacher or a wonderful female teacher in one place, and you go to the next school and it just doesn't have that capability, but on paper they look exactly the same. But what individuals can make such a difference. So a lot about this sort of narrative of influence sounds very highfalutin and sort of stratospheric, but it's about individuals. And how do you identify individuals within government or outside of government who can influence the influencers as well? Who's going to make that change? But yes, it's a real challenge. I don't think it's just a challenge on girls' education. I worked on negotiating the SDGs, and it's not just girls' education. It feels particularly sharp in girls' education, but it's a challenge that we face across the development community. And again, there's incentives there. If you're an NGO organisation and you're competing for your next contract with the one doing a similar project in the region next door, how much are you being candid and open about what isn't working as well as what is working? How much information are you really sharing? You go into a school in some of these places and you see the stickers from a wild number of organisations there, and you think, well, we're all here. But then you're not quite sure when you get the results or what you think of the results through, is that because of your intervention or is that because of the other organisation's intervention? How do you ascribe the results that you're getting through to specific interventions? And that goes right to the heart of this, of the knowledge gap or knowledge challenge on what works and what doesn't work and why. When you have, and it's not, no one's doing it out of bad intent. We're all intervening in locations where we think there is great need and they're the most marginalised girls and communities and so forth. But we need to get far better at knowing what we know and who's where, and to be a broader coalition and a community within this space, rather than tripping on each other's toes, and then, if you like, smudging our knowledge of what works and what doesn't work. So I think incentives at the heart of it, I really do, and I think that's not an easy thing. It's about individuals, it's about organisations. Where is it? And you need exemplars. You need to be able to point to one or two places, maybe more, hopefully more eventually, where it's worked. and someone's been rewarded, fated, again, we're all human. If you get someone is shone a positive spotlight on because they've tried to challenge their own system, that can make an impact for the governor next door, the national government down the road, in terms of what they want to do and what good looks like for them. But I think incentives are at the heart of all of this.
Yeah. I mean, your point about, how important it is that the individual leadership, political leadership, as the point that Martha was saying too, political leadership, leadership within implementing organizations, leadership within donor organizations, bilaterals, multilaterals, all of this, it really comes down to, really ensuring that you have that inspiring person who really believes in that vision and can make the same policy in two different places manifest into transformative change. So thank you for that. So Leanna, I want to maybe turn over to you. We'd love to hear your thoughts in terms of how, what at USAID gives you hope for USAID's contributions to lifting up girls' education globally and really trying to achieve this gender transformative systems-wide change for girls.
Yeah, so I would say in addition to the 5 things that Rob talked about are necessary, that focus is also a really necessary element. And I think sometimes some of the risk or challenge with talking about whole system change is that we risk watering things down. And I look at USAID and the fact that, gender is supposed to be a cross-cutting issue. And in some ways that means that gender is everywhere, but it's nowhere. And I think what we learned from our last strategy where we focused on early grade reading was that intense focus. We really were able to move the global dialogue around learning outcomes. And the shift in that dialogue in just 5 years still astounds me. And so I think, how do we do that around gender and gender transformative systems? But what I think really gives me hope at USAID is with our new US government strategy, our new USAID education policy that was launched in March, is the focus on equity and inclusion. Again, it's cross-cutting, so I think our challenge will be, how do we take that and run? But we're looking at those questions of gender and equity from preschool through secondary, tertiary, and then the transition to livelihoods, employability. And I would say what really gives me hope are a couple of the large initiatives and the focus that USAID has recently put. So the Young Women Transform Prize we launched last year. I had the honor actually 2 weeks ago to meet several young women leaders that have received grants through that program working at the grassroots. And I think those small private sector partners in some ways are able to really be tailored and reach audiences that maybe larger systems are not, and really address some of those barriers. So again, looking at all of the key actors who are out there, whatever the level it is, and where they can really have an impact. And then I maybe would just mention the Women's Global Development and Prosperity Initiative. It's a whole of government initiative for the US government, and our goal really is to reach 50 million women by 2025. So having that kind of intense focus on gender.
Thank you. So we have just like 2 minutes left. So I wanted to just throw a question to all of you. And this was also something that Rob had mentioned earlier about looking across the girl's lifetime, right? And that's the theme of our symposium today. It's, how do we ensure that dilution doesn't happen? That if we're focusing across the entire girl's lifetime, how do we ensure that our efforts are not diluted across organizations and institutions? But then also, how do we ensure that we adequately bridge the transitions from critical entry point to critical entry point across the girl's lifetime? So how do we achieve that balance between that? And I'll throw this out to any of you who wants to answer. Maybe we can get like 2 responses and then we'll wrap up. Anybody want to take that one? Go, Martha.
Yeah, one thing that is critical is there is no level of education that is independent of the other. It's a feed-in system. And that means we need to look at the whole education system in totality, starting with early childhood development. What happens at early childhood development determines what happens at primary school level. And what takes place at primary school level determines what takes place at secondary and transition into tertiary institutions and eventually into the world of work. So it's about looking, that's what lifelong learning is. So it means looking at the whole system in totality one feeding into the other and one supporting the other.
Great.
Yeah.
Last response from Bhagashree. Thank you.
It's just a question, I mean, not just related to what you ask. I mean, as in this space of gender transformative education, as we are taking 10 steps forward, we are also taking 5 steps backward, because the way governments are thinking, the policies, I won't name the countries here, but I think those are now new challenges that are coming up, and I think it's quite challenging for organizations like us to really think about that, and that's where our entire advocacy, influencing and working together to ensure gender transformative education becomes very, very critical.
Thank you. All right, please join me in thanking the panelists for their great remarks.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.